Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
And I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for joining me today. I am Ryan Backman, founder and executive director of Project Cold Case. Joining you today. We're a little bit late getting out of the gate today, but we just got a lot going on, so I appreciate you bearing with us and tuning in. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the number one question Project Cold Case gets from the families we serve, from the supporters that we speak to. Every time we go out and do a presentation, we speak to a civic group, a Rotary Club, a school class, any organization, any group of people, any individuals that we talk to, we seem to get this reoccurring question of how many cases has Project Cold Case solved? And it's just not quite that simple. We would love to just say that we solve cases, but that's not really our role in this. We have a very defined role as a nonprofit and as a advocacy group. We support the families of these cases, and we do that in a number of ways, a lot of which we've talked about in past Facebook Lives. But just kind of a general synopsis: we provide peer support, we provide support group meetings, we advocate for the families through law enforcement, we reach out to law enforcement, ask for meetings, and the big thing that we do is we raise awareness for those cases by sharing them on our website and on social media, on the banners you see behind me that we take whenever we go out and present these cases. So we're not investigating the cases. I mean, in short, we can't answer that question, how many have we solved, because we're not the investigators. We're not the detectives. We're a group of individuals that have some skills in assisting families, but those skills kind of fade away when it gets into investigations. That's not anything any of us in this office have ever done before, and it's not something that really should be handed off to just anybody. If you have a loved one's case and it's unsolved, it's best to leave that with professionals. We understand there can be some frustrations, and sometimes investigations don't go the way they should or the way we want them. But the reality is not just anybody can or should be investigating homicides or pretending to investigate homicides. And we would caution all our families to be very careful of people that tell you otherwise, because in a lot of cases, they could actually be detrimental to the future prosecution of your loved one's case. So that being said, we do have cases that have been featured on our website that have been solved. And we're actually very proud of that. These cases are cases that were submitted to us either by family or by law enforcement. They have been featured on our Faces of Unsolved Homicide page. They have been featured on our Facebook page, Instagram. Some of them have been spotlighted and shared via all those platforms. And so that really is our goal. We try to share these cases for many reasons. Obviously, the first and foremost being so that the family knows that someone still cares, that their loved one is not forgotten, and that there's always a place online where they can go and where they can send others to see their loved one and to share information about their loved one. But almost equal to that, we share these cases in hopes that someone will come forward with information now that maybe they weren't willing to come forward with when these murders happened, and will provide that information to law enforcement, either directly to law enforcement or through Crime Stoppers or Crime Line, in hopes that new information and new tips will come out and will lead to a resolution in a case. So if you follow our Facebook page, our social media pages, you saw over the weekend, we shared a graphic showing, and we're going to put it up right now, showing the cases that have been solved that were featured on our website. So that is, and actually we were going back through it and we missed one over the weekend. So there's actually 19 cases that have been solved that we know of on our website that have been featured on our website. And again, that is not to say that we solved 19 cases. That is to say that we helped raise awareness for those cases, that we allowed those family members to have, utilize our platform to get the word out about their loved ones' cases, and they took advantage of that. The cases, a lot of them, and I'm going to go through them a little bit and talk about some of these cases in hopes that some people will see the value and importance of sharing our stories and knowing that these victims, and their families were just like the rest of us, waiting one day for justice, and it came. So, that's a pretty cool thing and pretty important. And I also want to point out in these cases while I go through them that no case is similar, no case is the same. Some cases are similar, but none of them are the same. And there are always situations in these cases that are complicated and add layers of complexity. And so it can be, the highs of finally getting an arrest in your case can sometimes be followed with some very sad and upsetting news when justice either doesn't show up or comes in a form that is not adequate in our eyes. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. We probably won't have a real long Facebook Live, but I want to hit on these cases and again educate and share with our viewers and listeners, each of these cases, the significance of them, and where they stand as of today. While I was scrambling, why we're a little bit late, trying to figure out what the latest is on some of these cases that we're awaiting trial. So let's show the graphic, Clint, and I'm going to go through some of these and talk a little bit about them. So there's our 19 cases that have been featured on our site, and some of these range from some of the very first cases that were ever submitted to us. Haley Smith, the first one there in the top left. That one was one of the very first cases ever submitted because I knew that family prior to beginning Project Cold Case. And then some of them have been submitted to us more recently. But again, all of these families did, exactly what we ask all our families to do: submit the case, let us publicize it, let us try to raise some awareness for it. We can answer some questions along the way, and hope that by sharing that information that someone will come forward. That first case you see there in the top corner is Haley Smith. Haley was killed in a hit-and-run crash in St. Augustine in 2013. It took 4 years before an arrest happened. In 2017, they made an arrest. The defendant was serving time in jail for another hit-and-run, which injured someone but didn't kill them. And that defendant was arrested in Haley's case. Eventually, about not quite a year later, a few months later, that defendant pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Is currently serving that prison sentence. The next case you see there is Joseph Back. Mr. Back was killed in his home in Jacksonville, Florida in 1991, and it was not solved until 2019. And that case was solved just by detectives going back and rerunning fingerprints from the scene. The defendant in that case also pleaded guilty in 2019 and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. The next case you see there is Dorian Mann. This is a relatively newer case to us. Dorian was shot and killed while being carjacked in Orange Park, Florida in 2017. There were two defendants. Both have been arrested. One was the shooter. The other has pled guilty and we believe will be testifying against the shooter. The arrest happened in 2017, so 2 years after the murder, and is currently awaiting trial. Bonnie Haim is on our list there. Bonnie suspiciously disappeared from her Jacksonville home in 1993. Her very young, I think 3-year-old son at the time told investigators that daddy hurt mommy, but there was not enough evidence to prove that, and no body. Bonnie Haim's remains had not been recovered. Years later, in 2014, the son of Bonnie's son was who owned the house that he grew up in that his mom disappeared from, was in the yard doing some work and uncovered his mother's remains. So that was in 2014. In 2015, police arrested Bonnie Haim's former husband, and he was found guilty by a jury in 2019 and sentenced to life in prison. So the reason I'm kind of going through these, I'm not really getting into a lot of detail, but I want you to kind of, understand, like a hit and run, 17 years, a 28-year-old murder that was the defendant went free for 28 years and then was sentenced to 22 years. Bonnie Haim, all those years waiting for that family, waiting for answers and justice in a case that really had a known suspect. The husband was always suspected that he had done something, but there was not enough proof. That's another question that we get a lot of times is, will police know who killed my loved one? That may very well be true. That is true in far more cases than people realize. There are whodunits out there, and those are very frustrating for everybody involved. But cases where there's a known suspect, but not enough evidence, are particularly frustrating. Not just for the families, but for law enforcement as well. Another case that has been solved that was on our board was Angie Houseman. She was 9 years old. She was kidnapped and assaulted in 1993 in Missouri. The defendant was linked by DNA in 2019 and is awaiting trial. His DNA has also been linked to some other cases as well, sexual assault cases. So that one is awaiting trial. Sherry Prather is another one of our very, very, very early on case submissions. Knew the family before Project Cold Case existed. So she was submitted to us early on. Sherry went missing in October of 2012 in Jacksonville, Florida. Her remains were found a month later in the woods off Braddock Road. Defendant, again, this was another known suspect, known person of interest, not enough evidence to prove he had done it for 4 years. He was arrested in 2016 when evidence was brought to light and some witnesses came forward. He pleaded guilty in 2018 and was sentenced to 20 and a half years in prison. He's currently serving that sentence. Next on our list there, on our pictures, is Tammy Welch. If any of you watch our Facebook Lives, you've heard us reference Tammy Welch a number of times and talk about that trial and that case. Tammy was 10 years old. She was raped and murdered in Jacksonville, Florida in 1984. The defendant was not charged. DNA evidence was tested, and eventually he was charged in 2013. But it took all the way until 2018 to receive a trial and conviction. The state sought the death penalty, but the jury recommended life, and so the defendant was sentenced to life in prison in December of 2018. That was not a known suspect. He was the neighbor of Tammy Welch. He had been questioned that day, but he didn't. There was no reason to suspect him at that time, and it took a long time. Included the efforts of the Naval Criminal Investigative Services, NCIS, as well as the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office to eventually bring resolution to that case. That second row on the left is Alexis Wright, 2 years old, killed in 2003 in Alabama. The arrest didn't happen until 2018, and it ended up being the victim's aunt that was charged in that case, and is currently awaiting trial. The next resolved case on there is Nikki Redden. She was killed in Baldwin, Florida in 2016. It took 2 years before an arrest was made, and that defendant is awaiting trial. Freddie Fara, pretty much right there in the middle of your screen. That's another one of our more publicized cases, one that we've talked about in great detail over the years, including having Freddie's son Bobby sit down with us and talk about this case. Freddie was shot and killed at the food store that he owned in Jacksonville, Florida in 1974. It took 43 years before an arrest happened. And that kind of came to fruition because Bobby Fara, the victim's son, ran into a JSO cold case sergeant at a restaurant. They started talking, and Bobby asked the sergeant if he would take a look at his dad's case from 1974. They did. They found fingerprints that hadn't been run in a few years. Technology had improved, so they reran those fingerprints and came up with a suspect. He was arrested in 2017. Unfortunately, while awaiting trial, the key witness in the case was an eyewitness in 1974, passed away. And the state was not going to be able to bring in evidence that was provided by that witness that was key in getting a conviction. And so the state was faced with the option of drop the charges or seek a plea deal. They did seek a plea deal. The defendant agreed to plead guilty, to meet with the family and admit everything that had happened and talk about what happened, but only in return for time served. Because the state didn't have much of a choice, they elected to accept that deal, and the defendant in the Freddie Fara case served just under a year in county jail, pleaded guilty, was convicted of second-degree murder, sat down with the family to discuss what had happened, and then was released from jail and is now a free man. So, again, as we're going through these, you realize that that justice comes in different forms. Some of Freddie Fara's family is at peace with the way things were resolved, and some of them still struggle, and both of those are understandable. So, keep that in mind, that when an arrest happens, it doesn't always mean that the fight's over or that you get those answers you were seeking or justice. Next up there is Isaac Hodges, who was killed in Mississippi in 2013. It took 5 years, but 3 defendants were arrested in 2018 and are awaiting trial. Richard Robinson was killed in Texas in 2009. Again, 3 defendants involved in this. They were arrested in 2018. One has been convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The other 2 are women, and they are awaiting trial, is the best I could find. Tommy Campbell there on the end is our probably our latest solved case. He was killed in 2015 in Jacksonville, Florida. Defendant was arrested in 2019 and is awaiting trial. Down to the bottom row there, we have Cheryl Phillips. Cheryl was shot in the back during a graduation party in Nashville, Tennessee in 2006. It was a party including being thrown for class of 2006 high school graduates, one of which was her daughter. An argument broke out, a fight broke out, and somebody opened fire, shooting Cheryl in the back. It took years, but that was 2006. But in 2017, 2 defendants were charged and are awaiting trial. That was a situation where there were 30 witnesses, 30 people at the scene, but it took that long to solve the case, to make an arrest in the case. Next there on the bottom row is Corey Lakovich, who was stabbed to death in Missouri in 2013. The defendant was arrested in 2016 and pleaded guilty to involuntary manslaughter in 2018. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison. He claimed that it was self-defense, that there was an argument, and that he wrestled the knife away from Corey and then accidentally stabbed him, but it wasn't malicious. Evidence, couldn't really prove otherwise, although that's not what authorities believe what happened. But it's what you can prove, not always what actually happened. And so that defendant ended up being able to plead guilty to involuntary manslaughter and was sentenced to only 9 years. So again, another example of just because you get an arrest doesn't mean that you get some of the answers and justice that you hope for. Of course, we hope that all of these cases are resolved, and we hope that they all result in the sentence that the family feels comfortable with. But unfortunately, that's not always the case, and we just want to do our best to educate families and survivors so they know what to expect in the event that an arrest is made. Another case on there was Jamal Fleming. He was shot and killed in Lakeland, Florida in 2014. It took a few years, but the defendant was charged in 2016 and pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The next year in 2017, he was sentenced to 13 years in prison. Down there on the bottom row next to Jamal is Rebecca Blech. She was found shot to death on the side of the road in Michigan in 2014. This was one of those cases that was submitted to us. They thought she was the victim of a hit and run. She was an avid jogger, and they found her on the side of the road, deceased. When they performed the autopsy, they found that she had been shot in the head multiple times, and they really had no idea why she was killed or who killed her. And this is the case that I always refer to when people ask how many cases has Project Gold Case solved and why it's so difficult to answer that. I was sitting down at my desk, my computer, to do a spotlight on Rebecca's case in 2016. And I Googled her name to look up some stories and found out that an arrest had already been made. Now, she was on our Faces of Unsolved Homicide page, but we had not gotten to the spotlight portion yet. I was literally beginning to work on that when I found out that she had been arrested, that her case had been solved and the suspect arrested. As I read about the arrest, I found out that the suspect tried to abduct another young woman, and in doing so, this young woman jumped out of his moving van to save herself. Was injured, but was able to give police a description of the van, of the man, and a partial plate. When investigators went to his house, figured out who he was, they found a gun in his possession that the ballistics matched the murder of Rebecca Blech. So without that brave young girl literally jumping out of a moving van, one, there probably would have been another victim, but two, Rebecca's case may have never been solved. So we obviously couldn't take credit for something like that. We wouldn't want to take credit for something like that. That young woman is a hero that jumped out of that van and went to police. And then the detectives did a great job of following up and charging him. He was convicted in 2017 and received 2 life sentences because aside from the attempted abduction, he was also convicted in another murder of another young woman. So a very bad human being, and but he is now serving prison time, 2 life sentences. Daniel Rowe down there, second from the last picture, was shot and killed in Jacksonville in 2015. He was at his place of employment and had offered to take the trash out. It was a restaurant, out the back door and throw it in the dumpster when he was approached by 2 men trying to rob him. They shot him and killed him over $4, outside of his place of employment. That was in 2015. In 2017, the defendant was arrested. Both defendants were arrested. One pled guilty then and turned on the other one, and the other one was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, and the original one that pled guilty was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And the last case there that you see, Rebecca Mooneyham, is in the bottom right corner. She was shot in her home, literally laying on her lazy boy in her living room in 2009. And it took 10 years. Actually, just after the 10th anniversary of that case, we got word that somebody had come forward with information, and that police had made an arrest in that case. And that defendant is actually lived not far from them, but whether he was a known suspect all along or whether there was the new information that came forward, I'm not quite sure of that. This one is such a fresh case. This all happened, at the end of last year, 2019. So we're still gathering information on that. I did see, as I was preparing this stuff, that the defendant was granted a reduced bond. So I couldn't get much more into it of whether he's posted that bond and is out awaiting trial, or if he's still in jail awaiting trial. But we will again, we'll update these cases as we can. We'll update them as new cases are solved. The big thing again, this Facebook Live was just letting people know that, as helpless as sometimes we feel not being able to participate in our loved ones' investigation, there is still stuff we can do. Share their stories on social media. You can create your own justice page. You can reach out to other agencies and organizations and Crime Stoppers, and you can enhance your reward. You can reach out to your local media and ask them to, if they're willing to do a story on your loved one. And hopefully, again, we always say we don't need to reach 1 million people. We need to reach 1, but we may have to go through 1 million to get to that 1. And so that's our goal in raising awareness for these cases. We're very proud of those 19 cases that have been solved or an arrest has been made after they've been featured on our website and on our platform, and we appreciate everybody that continues to share these stories and like and comment on them and keep the momentum going so that more of these cases can be resolved and more of these families can get the answers they deserve. Thanks for watching this week. We'll be back next week with another Facebook Live. Here's the remembrances for all those victims that have been lost, and their anniversary is this week. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.